It was a March night in 2024 at the Chase Center when Steve Kerr made one of the most honest and surprising statements of his career as a coach. You can perceive that there are moments in the public life of great figures where vulnerability replaces diplomacy, where raw truth takes the place of politically correct answers. The Golden State Warriors had just won an exciting game against the Denver Nuggets, 118 to 114, with Steph Curry scoring 35 points in a vintage performance that reminded everyone why he is considered one of the greatest players in history. The game had been decided by a masterful sequence in the fourth quarter, where Curry hit 4 consecutive three-pointers, silencing the visiting crowd and igniting the home crowd. After the game, during the usual press conference, something unusual happened. Instead of the standard responses about system execution and team effort, Kerr seemed to be processing something deeper. There was a different intensity in his eyes, as if he were on the verge of sharing something he had kept for years. "Coach Kerr," asked Marcus Williams, veteran reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle, "does this performance by Steph remind you why you built a dynasty together?" Kerr paused for a moment longer than usual. He looked down, then at the ceiling, as if he were gathering courage to say something that could change how people saw him as a coach. "Marcus," Kerr began, his voice carrying an emotional weight that no one in the room was expecting, "I'm going to be brutally honest with you about something I've never said publicly before. How is it possible that a simple introduction can make an entire room of experienced journalists become completely attentive?" There was something in Kerr's tone that signaled that a significant revelation was about to happen. "Steph Curry made my career as a coach," Kerr said, the words coming out with a clarity that cut through any possibility of misinterpretation. "Without him, I would probably be just another former player trying to figure out how to coach in the NBA." The silence that followed was deafening. Cameras clicked furiously, pens ran across notepads, and you could feel the energy of the room changing completely. No one expected such vulnerability from a coach who had won 4 NBA championships. Something that touches deeply is when people in positions of power choose radical honesty over self-promotion. When they decide to credit others instead of accepting praise, they know they don't completely deserve. "Look," Kerr continued, clearly decided to go all the way with his confession, "I don't want to diminish the work we did as an organization, the system we built, or the incredible talent we have on this roster. But the truth is that having Steph Curry execute your ideas as a coach is it's like being a conductor who inherited an orchestra with Mozart at the piano." The analogy was perfect and devastating in its honesty. Kerr was admitting that, however competent he was as a coach, he had been blessed with a talent so extraordinary that it elevated any system beyond its original limitations. "When I arrived here in 2014, Kerr reflected, I was a rookie coach. I had ideas, of course, knowledge of the game, experience as a player. But Steph didn't just buy my ideas. He transformed them into something I didn't even know was possible." Have you ever wondered what it must feel like to have your ideas not just executed, but transformed into art by someone with a talent so rare that it transcends normal concepts of excellence? Kerr was describing exactly that experience. "I suggested offensive spacing, and Steph created shots from places that didn't exist in the playbooks," Kerr said, a nostalgic smile appearing on his face. "I asked for ball movement, and he orchestrated symphonies with passes that changed not just games, but the way basketball is played." Naturally, this leads us to understand that Kerr was distinguishing between technical competence and the kind of alchemy that happens when strategy meets transcendent talent. He wasn't minimizing his contribution, but recognizing that his contribution was magnified exponentially by having Steph Curry as the instrument of execution. "Do you want to know the truth about our championships?" Kerr asked, looking directly at the cameras. "Yes, we had a system. Yes, we had strategies. But Steph Curry took those systems and transformed them into magic. Literally. Things that shouldn't work worked because he made them work." What impresses most is how Kerr was willing to potentially diminish his own reputation in favor of a truth he clearly felt compelled to share. In a world where coaches normally claim credit for success and blame players for failures, this reversal was revolutionary. "I remember our first season together," Kerr continued, warming to his theme. "I implemented plays that I had learned from Greg Popovich, from Phil Jackson, from other great coaches. But when Steph executed those plays, they became something completely different. Something better. Something unprecedented." Jennifer Walsh, from The Athletic, raised her hand. "Coach, are you saying that your success is primarily due to having Curry?" "No," Kerr responded quickly, then paused to clarify. "I'm saying that my success is amplified tremendously by having Steph. The difference is important. I still had to create environments where his talent could flourish, still had to manage personalities, make in-game adjustments, build culture. But," he paused again, choosing his words carefully, "but it would be intellectually dishonest for me to pretend that I achieved what I achieved through coaching genius alone. I achieved it because I was smart enough to recognize Steph's gifts and humble enough to build systems that maximize those gifts rather than constraining them. How is it possible that admitting dependence on others could actually make someone appear stronger rather than weaker?" Kerr was demonstrating that true leadership often involves recognizing when your role is to facilitate greatness rather than create it. "Other coaches study for decades to achieve what I achieved in years," Kerr admitted. "That's not because I'm smarter than them, or because I work harder. It's because I had Steph Curry transforming my ideas into reality in ways that elevated both of us." The confession was becoming more profound with each passing moment. Kerr wasn't just crediting Curry for success. He was redefining what coaching excellence means in the first place. Anthony Zhang, from ESPN, leaned forward. "Steve, are you worried that this admission might hurt your reputation as a coach?" Kerr smiled, and for the first time all evening, it was a completely relaxed smile. "Anthony, I'm 58 years old. I've won 4 championships. At this point in my life, I'm much more interested in being honest than in protecting a reputation built on incomplete truths. Something that touches deeply is when people reach a point in their lives where authenticity becomes more important than image maintenance, where truth-telling supersedes self-promotion." Besides, Kerr added, "recognizing Steph's contributions doesn't diminish what our team accomplished. If anything, it makes me prouder. Because it means I was wise enough to see his gifts, humble enough to adapt my approach, and secure enough to let him be great without trying to take credit for his greatness." A room full of hardened sports journalists was clearly moved by Kerr's vulnerability. Several were nodding. Others were frantically taking notes. All were witnessing something rarely seen in professional sports: complete intellectual honesty from someone with everything to lose. "One final question," said Ryan Johnson from NBC Sports Bay Area. "Do you have any regrets about being so dependent on one player?" Kerr thought for a long moment, then broke into the widest smile of the evening. "Ryan, my only regret is that it took me 10 years to be this honest publicly. Steph Curry didn't just make my career. He taught me what great leadership actually looks like. And the greatest lesson he taught me is that acknowledging others' contributions doesn't make you smaller. It makes you bigger." With those words, Steve Kerr had fundamentally altered how people would view his legacy, his relationship with Steph Curry, and possibly how coaches throughout the sports world would think about credit, success, and the true meaning of leadership. As journalists filed out of the press conference, many were already planning stories about honesty, humility, and the revolutionary nature of Kerr's admission. But more importantly, they had witnessed something rare in sports: a powerful leader choosing vulnerability over vanity, truth over image. But this confession was just the beginning of what would become one of the most profound examinations of the coach-player relationship in sports history. To completely understand the weight of Steve Kerr's confession, we need to go back 10 years in time, to May 2014, when a 48-year-old former player nervously accepted his first job as head coach in the NBA. You can perceive that certain partnerships transcend their original intentions, creating synergies that neither party could have anticipated when the relationship began. Steve Kerr had just left a comfortable job as a TNT commentator to take command of a Golden State Warriors team that was in transition. They had fired Mark Jackson after 2 consecutive playoff seasons, a controversial decision that had divided the fan base and created uncertainty about the direction of the franchise. "I was absolutely terrified," Kerr would admit years later. "I had theoretical knowledge about coaching, had played for some of the greatest coaches in history, but had never actually been responsible for 82 games, for managing egos, for making decisions that could make or break careers. How is it possible that success stories often begin with profound uncertainty and self-doubt?" Kerr was entering a situation where he had more to lose than to gain: a comfortable broadcast career exchanged for the high-pressure world of NBA coaching, where failure is public and permanent. "My first meeting with Steph was in June 2014, Kerr remembered during a later interview. "I had prepared extensively, studied film for hours, developed detailed plans for how we could improve the offense. But when I actually sat down with him, I realized I was about to learn much more than I was about to teach." Steph Curry, then 26 years old, had already established himself as a rising star, but hadn't yet reached the transcendent level that would redefine the game. He was coming off a season where he averaged 24 points and 8.5 assists. Impressive numbers, but not yet the otherworldly statistics that would follow. "Steve came in with such humility," Steph later recalled. "He didn't try to impress me with his championship rings as a player or talk down to me. He genuinely wanted to understand how I saw the game, what I thought we could improve, where I felt comfortable operating." Something that touches deeply is realizing that great partnerships often begin not with one person trying to dominate or impose their will, but with mutual respect and genuine curiosity about each other's perspectives and capabilities. During those first few weeks of preparation for training camp, something extraordinary began to happen. Kerr would suggest spacing concepts that he had learned from studying San Antonio's offense, and Steph would not only grasp them immediately, but envision variations that Kerr hadn't considered. "I remember showing him a basic motion offense concept," Kerr said, "something I had learned from watching Greg Popovich work." Steph listened politely, nodded, then said, "What if we ran that, but I started 35 feet from the basket instead of 25? I initially thought it was crazy. Then I realized he was seeing possibilities that were completely outside traditional basketball thinking. Naturally, this leads us to understand that Steph wasn't just learning Kerr's system. He was evolving it in real time, pushing boundaries that even experienced coaches hadn't considered pushing. "Our first training camp was a revelation," Kerr continued. "Every drill I designed, Steph would execute perfectly, Then ask, can we add this element? Or, what if we did this differently? He wasn't challenging my authority. He was genuinely trying to make everything better. What impresses most is how Steph's questions weren't born from ego or desire to show off, but from authentic curiosity about maximizing the potential of every possession, every play, every strategic concept. I had designed what I thought was a sophisticated motion offense, Kerr admitted. Pick and rolls, off-ball screens, careful spacing, traditional stuff that had worked for other teams. But Steph transformed those basic concepts into something that looked like basketball from the future. Daniel Patel, then assistant coach, observed those early interactions with fascination. Steve would draw up a play during timeout, and by the time Steph executed it in the game, it had become something completely different. Not because Steph was ignoring instructions, but because he was improving them on the fly. During their first preseason together, patterns began to emerge that would define their relationship for the next decade. Kerr would provide framework, structure, and strategic foundation. Steph would take those elements and transform them through execution that transcended the original intent. Our very first preseason game was against the Lakers, Kerr remembered. I had called a simple pick-and-roll play. For Steph, he saw the defense, made a split-second decision to reject the screen, stepped back to 28 feet, and buried a three-pointer that had the crowd gasping. That's when I realized I wasn't just coaching him. I was witnessing the evolution of basketball in real time. Have you ever wondered how it feels to create something and then watch it become something far greater than you initially envisioned? Kerr was experiencing exactly that, watching his coaching concepts become art through Steph's execution. By November of that first season, I had stopped trying to limit Steph's range, Kerr confessed. Initially, I thought 28-foot three-pointers were low-percentage shots. But Steph was making them at higher percentages than most players make 15-footers. I had to adapt my understanding of what was possible. Christopher Lee, the team's video coordinator, witnessed this evolution daily. Coach Kerr would show Steph film of how other teams ran certain plays, and Steph would absorb it, then create variations that were somehow both more complex and more efficient than the original versions. Something that touches deeply is realizing that the greatest teacher-student relationships often involve role reversals, where the supposed student ends up teaching the supposed teacher about possibilities they never imagined. I remember one specific moment in January 2015, Kerr said, his voice taking on an almost reverent tone. We were playing Portland, down by 3 with 20 seconds left. I called timeout to draw up a play to get a good look. Steph listened to my instructions, then said quietly, "Coach, I can get a better shot than what you drew up." I looked at him and said, "Then take it." What happened next became legendary. Steph took the inbound pass, dribbled to half court, pulled up from 37 feet with 2 defenders on him, and buried the game-tying three-pointer as if it were a routine warm-up shot. Walking back to the huddle after that shot, Kerr remembered, I realized something profound. I wasn't just managing Steph Curry's talent. I was witnessing the emergence of something that transcended traditional basketball categories. And my job wasn't to control that, but to create conditions where it could flourish. How is it possible that recognizing your limitations as a teacher can actually make you a better teacher? Kerr was discovering that sometimes the greatest coaching involves knowing when to get out of the way and let genius express itself. By our championship run in 2015, Kerr reflected, our relationship had evolved into something I never expected. I would provide structure, guidance, strategic framework. Steph would take those elements and create magic that elevated not just our team, but the entire sport. Catherine Clark, longtime Warriors beat reporter, noticed this dynamic. Other coaches tried to put Steph into their systems. Steve learned to build systems around Steph's capabilities. It was like watching someone design a music composition specifically for Mozart, rather than asking Mozart to play something generic. Our first championship together taught me something invaluable about leadership, Kerr said. Great leaders don't diminish others to make themselves look better. They create environments where others can be greater than anyone thought possible, including themselves. Naturally, this leads us to understand that Kerr's greatest strength as a coach wasn't imposing his will, but recognizing and amplifying the transcendent talent that was already there, waiting for the proper conditions to fully emerge. By 2016, when Steph had his unanimous MVP season, Kerr admitted, "I stopped pretending that our success was primarily due to my coaching innovations. It was primarily due to Steph's innovations, executed within frameworks that I was wise enough to keep flexible." But this realization would create a different kind of challenge for Kerr, the internal struggle between public perception of his coaching genius and private knowledge of how much his success depended on having the most transformative player in basketball history. As the titles accumulated and praise rained down on Steve Kerr, a silent and complex struggle began to take shape in his mind. You can perceive that sometimes public success can create a painful dissonance when we know internally that the narratives about our achievements don't tell the complete story. It was 2017, after the Warriors' second consecutive championship, and Steve Kerr was being celebrated in every corner of the sports world as a tactical genius. Specialized magazines called him revolutionary. Analysts debated his offensive innovations. Other coaches studied his systems as if they were sacred texts of modern basketball. The weight of the facade was becoming unbearable, Kerr would confess years later. Not because I was incompetent. I knew I contributed significantly. But because I knew that without Steph Curry, none of that would have happened the way it happened. How is it possible that professional recognition, something that should generate satisfaction, can transform into a source of anxiety when we feel we don't completely deserve the credit we're receiving? Kerr was experiencing exactly this internal conflict. I would go to coaching conferences, and they would treat me as if I had discovered some secret formula. Kerr remembered during an intimate conversation with Benjamin Lewis, a veteran reporter who had covered the NBA for decades. They wanted to know my secrets, my innovations, and I knew that my main secret was having Steph Curry on my team. During the summer of 2017, Kerr went through what he later described as a professional existential crisis. He was being offered lucrative book deals to write about his coaching philosophy. Major universities wanted him to give lectures at coaching clinics, and other franchises were trying to poach assistants who worked with him, believing that they had learned some magical formula. Something that touches deeply is when success brings recognition that we know we don't fully deserve, creating an internal tension between public image and private knowledge that can be psychologically exhausting to maintain. I remember a specific moment during the 2017 finals. Kerr said, "We were leading Cleveland. Steph had just made another impossible shot, and cameras cut to me on the sideline. Commentators were talking about my brilliant play calling. But the truth was, I had called a completely different play. Steph had improvised something better in real time." Timothy Walker, then assistant coach, witnessed Kerr's internal struggle firsthand. Steve would come into coaches' meetings and say things like, "We need to be honest about why we're successful." He was constantly trying to make sure we gave Steph proper credit, but publicly everyone wanted to focus on the coaching staff. The hardest part, Kerr admitted, wasn't that people gave me too much credit. It was that I was starting to doubt my own contributions. When everything you touch turns to gold because you have Midas on your team, you begin to question whether you have any actual skill yourself. Naturally, this leads us to understand that Kerr was facing a version of imposter syndrome specifically related to coaching. Success, questioning whether his achievements were due to his abilities or simply being in the right place at the right time with the right player. During the 2017 to 2018 season, this internal tension began to affect how Kerr approached his job. He became overly cautious about taking credit for victories, almost defensive in interviews when reporters praised his tactical decisions. "I was overcorrecting," Kerr acknowledged, "instead of accepting that I deserved some credit while giving Steph most of it. I was trying to give Steph all of it. And that wasn't fair to either of us, or to the rest of the team." David Rodriguez, longtime Warriors executive, noticed changes in Kerr's demeanor during this period. Steve seemed uncomfortable with attention. During championship celebrations, he would always deflect to players. During interviews about our success, he would immediately pivot to talking about Steph's greatness. It was admirable, but also concerning. What impresses most is how Kerr's humility, while admirable, was beginning to create its own problems. A reluctance to own any part of success that was clearly collaborative rather than solely attributable to either coach or player. The breaking point came during Game 5 of the 2018 Finals. Kerr revealed, "We were about to clinch another championship, and during a timeout, I gave what I thought was a routine instruction. Steph executed it perfectly. We scored, and the crowd went crazy. But walking back to the bench, I realized I was feeling guilty for even that small moment of tactical contribution." Marcus Thompson, Warriors beat writer, observed this internal conflict playing out publicly. Steve would praise Steph effusively in press conferences, but he seemed almost uncomfortable when reporters praised him. It was like he was carrying some burden that none of us fully understood. "I talked to my wife about it," Kerr said. "I told her, I feel like I'm being celebrated for winning lottery tickets rather than for any actual skill." She said something that changed my perspective. Even lottery winners have to be smart enough to buy tickets in the right place. Have you ever wondered how relationships with extraordinary people can make us question our own worth, even when we're contributing significantly to shared success? Kerr was learning that proximity to transcendent talent can create self-doubt, even when our contributions are meaningful. The breakthrough came when I realized I was doing a disservice not just to myself, but to Steph, Kerr explained. By not owning my contributions, I was implying that his success was purely individual. But great players need great systems, great teammates, great environments, and I was part of creating those conditions. Samuel Clark, sports psychologist who worked with several NBA teams, offered insight into Kerr's struggle. High-achieving individuals who work closely with transcendent talents often experience this. They know they're good at what they do, but they also know they're working with someone special. Finding balance between humility and self-recognition is one of the most difficult challenges in professional sports. During the off-season after the 2018 championship, Kerr made a conscious decision to reframe his relationship with success and recognition. Rather than feeling guilty about praise, he would focus on being accurate about contributions, both his own and Steph's. "I decided to stop being defensive about my role," Kerr said. "Instead, I would be precise about it. Yes, Steph Curry makes everything better. Yes, having him makes coaching easier in some ways and more challenging in others. But I still have to create systems, manage personalities, make adjustments. Those contributions matter, even if they're amplified by having a generational talent." Andrea Hall, then team psychologist, worked with Kerr during this period of self-reflection. Steve came to understand that diminishing his own contributions wasn't honoring Steph. It was creating a false narrative that great players succeed in a vacuum. The truth is more complex and more interesting. By 2019, I had found a healthier perspective, Kerr reflected. I wasn't a coaching genius who could win with anyone, but I also wasn't just a placeholder who happened to be standing next to Steph Curry. I was a coach who recognized extraordinary talent and built environments where that talent could flourish. And that is actually a skill, even if it's not the skill people think it is. Something that touches deeply is realizing that Kerr's journey wasn't just about managing success, but about finding an honest relationship with his own contributions to that success, neither overstating nor understating his role in creating magic. The goal became to be truthful rather than modest, Kerr said. Truthful about what I brought to the partnership, truthful about what Steph brought, and truthful about how those elements combined to create something neither of us could have achieved alone. But this new understanding would lead to another revelation, that embracing truth about collaborative success could actually make both partners stronger, and that honesty about dependencies could become the foundation for even greater achievements. Steve Kerr's transformation from someone who struggled against the truth to someone who embraced it completely didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that culminated in that public confession in March 2024, but which had begun years before with a private conversation that would forever change how he saw his role and his legacy. You can perceive that the most transformative moments of our lives frequently involve honest conversations with the people we respect most, where mutual vulnerability creates space for growth that neither party expected. It was December 2019, after a routine victory against the Phoenix Suns, when Steph Curry knocked on Kerr's office door with an unusually serious expression. The Warriors were in the middle of a difficult season, dealing with injuries and adjustments, but there was something in Steph's demeanor that suggested this conversation would be about much more than basketball tactics. "Coach," Steph said, closing the door behind him, "can I talk to you about something that has been bothering me?" Kerr looked up from the game film he was reviewing, immediately sensing the gravity in Steph's tone. "Of course, Steph. What's on your mind?" "I've noticed that you deflect every time someone praises your coaching," Steph said, sitting down across from Kerr's desk. "And I think you're doing a disservice, not just to yourself, but to our entire partnership. How is it possible that players can sometimes see coaches' blind spots more clearly than coaches can see them themselves?" Steph was about to offer Kerr a perspective that would fundamentally change how the coach viewed his own contributions. "I don't understand," Kerr replied, genuinely puzzled. "Steve," Steph said, using his first name rather than coach, a signal that this was a personal conversation rather than a professional one. "When you constantly deny your role in our success, you're implying that I succeed in a vacuum. But that's not true, and it's not fair to either of us. Something that touches deeply is when people we mentor begin to mentor us back, offering insights that our own self-reflection couldn't provide. You created systems that allowed me to flourish," Steph continued. "You managed personalities, made adjustments, built a culture where everyone could be their best. Just because I execute doesn't mean you don't contribute. And when you deny that, you're actually diminishing what we accomplished together." Kerr sat in silence for a long moment, processing the implications of what Steph was saying. "But Steph, everyone knows you're the reason we win. I just want to make sure you get proper credit." "I get plenty of credit," Steph smiled. "But you know what I'm most proud of? That we figured out how to work together in a way that made both of us better than we could be alone. And that's not possible if only one person gets credit. Naturally, this leads us to understand that Steph wasn't just defending Kerr's contributions. He was articulating a philosophy about collaborative excellence that would reshape how both men viewed their partnership. From that moment on, Kerr later reflected, I started to approach success differently. Instead of feeling guilty about recognition, I began to focus on being accurate about our respective contributions. And surprisingly, that honesty made our working relationship even stronger. Over the following years, Kerr began to model a different kind of leadership, one that embraced interdependence rather than trying to minimize it. During press conferences, he would specifically credit Steph's innovations while also acknowledging the strategic frameworks that enabled those innovations. I stopped saying, "It's all Steph," Kerr explained. Instead, I started saying, "Here's how we work together, here's what I bring, here's what Steph brings, and here's how those elements combine to create something special." And that felt much more honest, and ultimately more powerful. Melissa Young, who joined the Warriors front office in 2020, witnessed this evolution in Kerr's leadership style. Steve became incredibly comfortable talking about collaborative success. He would praise Steph effusively, but he would also own his contributions without apology. It was fascinating to watch. What impresses most is how this honesty began to influence not just Kerr and Steph, but the entire Warriors organization and eventually other teams around the league. Other coaches started to adopt similar approaches, observed Amy Robinson, NBA coaching consultant. Instead of trying to take all credit or deflect all credit, they began to talk honestly about how great coaching requires great players, and great players require great systems. Steve pioneered a more authentic way of discussing success in sports. By 2021, Kerr had developed what he called his interdependence philosophy, a framework for understanding how individual excellence and systemic excellence combine to create transcendent results. I realized that my legacy shouldn't be coach who won championships despite having great players, Kerr explained. It should be coach who maximized great players' potential while creating conditions for sustained excellence. And that's actually harder and more valuable than individual brilliance. During the 2022 championship run, this philosophy was evident in every aspect of how Kerr approached leadership. He was simultaneously confident about his strategic contributions and generous in crediting players' execution, creating an environment where everyone felt valued for their specific contributions. "Steve taught me something important about leadership," said Kimberly King, Warriors team psychologist. "He showed that acknowledging dependencies doesn't make you weak. It makes you honest. And honest leaders are ultimately more effective because they build trust rather than ego." The beautiful thing about embracing interdependence, Kerr reflected, is that it doesn't diminish individual contributions, it contextualizes them. Steph's greatness becomes even more impressive when you understand how he transforms systems. My contributions become more valuable when you understand how they create conditions for his greatness to flourish. In a conversation with longtime friend and former teammate Michael Jordan, Kerr articulated this philosophy in personal terms. "Michael, you were great because you elevated everyone around you while being individually dominant. That's what Steph does, and that's what I try to do as a coach. Excellence is contagious when you create the right environment. How is it possible that embracing our dependencies can actually make us more powerful rather than less?" Kerr had discovered that leadership based on honest assessment of strengths and needs creates stronger foundations than leadership based on pretending to be self-sufficient. By 2023, our partnership had reached a new level, Kerr said about his relationship with Steph. "We were both comfortable with what we brought to the table, No false modesty, no inflated egos, just honest assessment and mutual appreciation. This evolution culminated in that March 2024 press conference where Kerr made his public confession. But by then, it wasn't really a confession. It was simply the public articulation of an understanding that had been years in development. When I said publicly that Steph made my career, Kerr explained, I wasn't diminishing myself. I was acknowledging that great partnerships involve people making each other better in ways that neither could achieve alone. And I'm proud to be part of that kind of partnership. Something that touches deeply is realizing that Kerr's journey from self-doubt to confident interdependence became a template for how other coaches and players could approach collaborative success. Steve's honesty gave me permission to be equally honest, Steffi said during a recent interview. I could acknowledge that coaching matters, that systems matter, that I need a great framework to be my best, and that honesty made both of us better at our jobs. Today, when young coaches ask Kerr for advice about working with star players, his response has become legendary. Don't try to diminish their contributions to make yourself look bigger. Don't try to take credit that isn't yours. Focus on creating conditions where their greatness can flourish. Then be proud of your role in that process. Great leadership isn't about being the greatest individual. It's about making great individuals even greater. My legacy isn't that I'm a coaching genius who can win with anyone, Kerr concluded during a recent coaching clinic. My legacy is that I recognized transcendent talent and built environments where that talent could reach its full potential. And honestly, that's much more valuable than individual brilliance because it's replicable and sustainable. You can perceive that Kerr's transformation from someone struggling with collaborative success to someone modeling healthy interdependence has influenced an entire generation of coaches and players who now approach partnerships with greater honesty and ultimately greater effectiveness. In the end, Kerr reflected, admitting that Steph Curry made my career wasn't an admission of weakness. It was recognition of a truth that made both of us stronger. And if my legacy is being the coach who figured out how to maximize Steph Curry's gift to basketball, then I'm proud of that legacy. Because maximizing transcendent talent is one of the highest callings any coach can have.